The moonlit night was cold. It was February 17th, 1864, and 8 Confederate soldiers made their way to a low, black craft lashed to a dock in the waters of Breach Inlet, on the coast of South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. One by one, they squeezed through the 2 oval hatches in the top of the vessel and climbed through the dark, cramped interior of the metal tube. 7 of the men took their seats, side by side, on a narrow wooden bench. The hatches clanged shut. Inside the vessel, the sole illumination was by a candle, and we can only guess what each crewman was thinking as they sat in the flickering light. They waited for their commander, Lieutenant George Dixon, to give the word to get underway. Bent over by the curved hull, the 7 sailors took hold of the crankshaft in front of them, and at his signal they began to turn it. The force of their efforts, magnified by the submarine's gearbox, began to turn the propeller at the stern of the craft. The dark water of Breach Inlet slowly churned behind the submarine, and they began to slide silently away from the dock. The Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley was underway and headed towards the Union ships that blockaded the harbor. Approximately 2 hours after its departure, the submarine arrived at its target, the Union sloop USS Housatonic. Illuminated by the moonlight, the H.L. Hunley was spotted by lookouts, who began firing at the dark shape in the water. The submarine aimed for the Union ship's starboard beam. A short time later, naval history was made. After sinking the Union blockade ship USS Housatonic, there was a light witnessed near the sloop. This may have been a message to shore from the H.L. Hunley, or merely a reflection from one of their portholes on the water. But they never returned, vanishing without a trace. The submarine that became known as the H.L. Hunley was actually the 3rd in a series of fully submersible fighting boats. The first 2 were sunk by the Confederates when Union forces had gotten too close to them, threatening capture. The 3rd attempt was eventually named for one of its benefactors and innovators, Horace L. Hunley. It was built in Mobile, Alabama in the spring of 1863 and launched in July of the same year. Constructed from rolled iron plates and custom-created fittings, it was around 40 feet in length and approximately 4 feet in diameter amidship. It was decided that it would serve its purpose of attacking Union ships better in Charleston, South Carolina, and so was transported there by railcar in August of 1863. Its job? To loosen the coils of the Union snake. The Union plan from the beginning of the war, as proposed by General Winfield Scott, was to surround the Confederate States in a naval blockade, imposing tariffs on all vessels trying to trade with the Confederacy. The plan was mockingly called the Anaconda Plan, but there was less and less humor as time went on, and the cotton gathered on the piers and the needed supplies often failed to enter the ports of the South. The tactical concept of the H.L. Hunley was a simple one. A submerged vessel would avoid detection when attacking the Union ships blockading southern ports. Stealth, rather than might, would allow them to dive under an enemy vessel while towing a contact explosive, and when the torpedo, as it was called then, struck the hull of the ship, it would detonate. There would be no safety outside Confederate harbors. Unfortunately, the towed torpedo was more unsafe for the submariners. They soon found when they stopped, the device kept moving towards them. They risked becoming their own first casualty. A similar concept that had been in use since 1863 was the David-class torpedo boat. Steam-driven, they ran partially submerged and were armed with a torpedo, but not a towed version. Instead, the Confederates armed the torpedo boats with a contact torpedo mounted on the end of a long pipe or spar on the bow of the craft. The spars were around 20 or so feet in length and fixed so that the commander of the boat had to steer his nose directly into the side of the ship he was attacking. Historians have always had more information about the CSS David and those in its class, since examples, like the boat seen beached here, were captured during the war. Records also reveal that the decision was made to use a similar type of spar torpedo on the H.L. Hunley. Records for the H.L. Hunley have always been more sparse, and with no submarine to go by, guesswork has played a major role over fact. This replica from the 1960s, shown here outside the Charleston Museum, has a very short wooden spar and carries a contact torpedo. While the detonators depicted are accurate to a style available, and the size is close to accurate, the wooden spar has long been debated, as has its length and location. Many have theorized that the H.L. Hunley actually had an iron spar, and it was not deck-mounted but keel-mounted. It has been commonly believed that it included a torpedo with a barbed end. Even the original display of the iron spar at the Submarines Museum, while refuting the wooden spar theory, encouraged the belief in a keel-mounted barbed torpedo. Numerous written records say that the torpedo was not filled with the 65 pounds of black powder that the David boats carried, but that the H.L. Hunleys had over twice as much, 135 pounds inside. It has been thought that the barbed point was driven into the Housatonic's hull, and then the submarine was cranked in reverse, backing away from the ship. A line, spooling from the outside of the submarine, would have become taut and tripped the firing mechanism. Many reproductions have depicted the torpedo system in this way: a barbed tip on the end of an iron spar, and a spool that fed out until the automatic detonation of the torpedo lodged in the hull of the target. The belief for years was that the H.L. Hunley rammed home its torpedo, backed away to 100 feet or more, and then detonated the device. The Housatonic sank in under 5 minutes and cost 5 Union sailors their lives. There is, however, a problem with a great deal of what we have believed to be true. We now know it is completely inaccurate. On August 8, 2000, 5 years after its discovery on the ocean bottom, the H.L. Hunley was raised for research and conservation by historians and archaeologists. Certain mysteries were cleared up almost immediately. Researchers were able to see the bow portion of the keel, and attached to it was an iron plate with a large bolt hole through it for attaching the iron spar. This discovery meant that the wooden bar on top must have been a boom to support the spar and to change its angle if needed. While the CSS David had a central spar, the H.L. Hunley carried a keel-mounted spar of approximately the same length, although the submarine was armed with a larger charge in the torpedo. As the archaeologists and researchers carefully began sifting through the contents of the submarine, personal effects, like Lieutenant Dixon's binoculars and pocket watch, were found, and the watch provided an important clue. The time on his watch, 8:23, is seemingly too early for the attack, which was reported by the deck guards who saw the submarine coming towards them at 8:45. The discrepancy was finally explained when it was discovered that the two navies ran on different times: local apparent solar time for the South and local mean solar time for the Union. The difference, the missing 26 or so minutes, meant that Lieutenant Dixon's watch had stopped at the moment of the attack. A very revealing insight came when the research team discovered the end of the H.L. Hunley spar, where the torpedo had been mounted. When x-rayed before cleaning, it was evident that there was something through it and around it. On January 28th of 2013, the head archaeologist for the H.L. Hunley project, Dr. Maria Jacobson, held a press conference and provided some startling news. The spar was yielding far more answers to the fate of the submarine and her crew than researchers might have ever suspected. Due to a process that occurs over time, sand had encrusted the metal spar end and the submarine as well in a concrete-like sleeve. The restoration process involved removing the concretion, and when completed, they were stunned at what they found. The sleeve, or thimble from the torpedo, which should have been gone, was still wrapped around the spar. The copper jacket was rolled backwards towards the H.L. Hunley, away from the blast. Unexpectedly, they also found through both the spar and the thimble was a bolt with a nut. It was evident by looking at the rear of the sleeve that the metal had been driven backwards, shearing the bolt hole into a slot and rolling the copper in front as it went. The torpedo had been bolted to the submarine. Drawings from the period that were believed to show a torpedo used in the American Civil War had no bolt through their sleeve, but did show a contact detonator on their nose. The picture was seemingly not complete. Today, a drawing of the same concept of a contact torpedo now includes a square bolt head as found on the Confederate submarine spar. But what does all this mean for our knowledge of the H.L. Hunley? The new information gleaned from archaeological research so far shows that the submarine had a keel-mounted spar between 16 and 20 feet in length. It was supported by a boom and tipped with a bolted-on contact torpedo, which was never left in the USS Housatonic side. The H.L. Hunley was not here, 100 feet away from the charge when it was detonated, but was instead here, less than 20 feet away from the blast. The concussive force of the resulting shockwave would have been severe, and many at first believed it would have incapacitated the crew. However, the U.S. Navy concluded through medical research and black powder testing, seen here at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, that it was unlikely that the overpressure rendered the entire crew of the H.L. Hunley unconscious. Likely, they were deafened and disoriented, but awake. Once the submarine was placed in its tank for preservation at the Warren Lash Conservation Center, the process of caring for the inside and outside of the submarine and its artifacts was begun. As the archaeologists continued their research and preservation, they were hoping to answer many more questions and correct many myths and misconceptions about the submarine's mission and fate. The concretion that had encapsulated the whole of the H.L. Hunley hid many more pieces of information that only time and effort revealed to those who were waiting to see what might next be learned. Why and how did she sink? What happened to the crew? Did they drown or run out of air? Today, through the efforts of the H.L. Hunley's team of archaeologists and scientists, we have a better picture of what the submarine looked like. Computer models such as these help us to see the way it appeared. Unfortunately, they do not present complete answers to those questions. But can science tell us more about the crew? More about the loss of the submarine? Yes, and they have provided facts, clues, and sound theories where there have been no answers before. Under the sand, encrusting the H.L. Hunley's bow, was hidden a possible answer. They found damage, most likely caused when the spar rammed the Housatonic's hull. A pipe near the forward ballast tank shifted, opening a small hole seen here. In calculations using models of the H.L. Hunley, the U.S. Navy found that the opening, despite its small size, could have caused the submarine to sink in just 3 to 4 minutes. The possibility of small arms damage to the submarine is also being considered, and iron fragments, likely from the forward hatch, were found on the floor of the submarine. Archaeologists have determined that the air exchange snorkel was not working that night, and the trip out had been long enough to use the available air supply. With their pump not set to push out water, somehow the H.L. Hunley traveled approximately 1,000 feet past the Housatonic, and then came to rest on the bottom. While the recovery and scientific investigation of the H.L. Hunley has told us a great deal, there are still questions that need answers, and some that may never be answered. For some mysteries, there are now better theories, but they continue to be a mystery. It remains possible, however, that the crew of the submarine were victims of their own attack after all. If you happen to visit Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, you might find yourself approaching this stately tree with its small clusters of graves beneath it. 8 of them are newer. They are the final crew of the H.L. Hunley, and they have joined Horace Hunley himself and the 12 others from 2 previous crews who died in the submarine. These brave men risked all in an untried technology, one which proved more deadly to its own crews than those of the enemy. Now, because of the merging of history and science, we understand better what happened when they faced their fears and sailed boldly into harm's way.